Hello, lovelies, and welcome to Midnight on Call. I'm your host, MD Who, and the doctor is in. And tonight we are going to be reading the first part of Rip Van Winkle. But before we do, let's say hello to some of our patients this evening, because good bedside manner is very important. Hello, Christine Baker. I'm so happy to see you. I see we have another person in the chat, or another person viewing, lurking. Hello to you as well. Now, tonight it's actually going to be a cold. Actually read this one before, but I have been able to pinpoint where a good stopping point is. So, without further ado, let's get started. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Hello, Boggs official. Very happy to see you. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of day, produces some change in the magical hues and wives far and near as perfect barometers. Oh, thank you, Christine. That's very sweet of you. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple, and print their bold outlines high. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of grey vapours about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, will glow and light up like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the voyager must have descried the light smoke curling up from a village whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees. Just landscape. It is a little village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province. Just about the beginning of the government of the good Peter Stuyvesant, may he rest in peace, and there were some of the houses of the original settlers standing within a few years, built of small yellow bricks surmounted with weathercocks. In that same village, and in one of these houses, which, to tell the precise truth, was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten, many years since, while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow by the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant, and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbour, and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity. For those men are most apt to be obsequious. I think that's how you say it. Obsequious and conciliating abroad, who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and a curtain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long-suffering. A termagant wife may, therefore, in some respects, be considered a tolerable blessing, and, if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. Certain is that Certain it is that he was a great favourite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles and never failed, over their evening gossiping, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The great error in Rip's composition was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. It could not be from the want of assiduity or perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together, trudging through woods and swamps, and up hill and down dale, and shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. He would never refuse to assist a neighbor, even in the roughest toil, and was foremost a man at all country frolics, for husking Indian corn or building stone fences. The women of the village, too, used to employ him to run their errands, and to do such little odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not do for them. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anyone's business but his own. But as to doing family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong, and would go wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would die among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow more quickly in his field than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of setting in just Is it? I thought it was just my internet connection. Where was I? In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong, and would go wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling apart to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow more quickly in his fields than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of setting in just as he had some outdoor work to do. I lost my place. Here, through his patrimonial estate had dwindled away under his management acre by acre, and until there was little more left than a mere patch of Indian corn and potatoes. Yet it was the worst conditioned farm in the neighborhood. His children, too, were as ragged and wild as they belonged to nobody. His God promised to inherit the habits with the old clothes of his father. He was generally seen trooping like a colt at his mother's heels, equipped in a pair of his father's cast-off galligaskins, which he had much ado to hold up with one hand, as a fine lady does her train in bad weather. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals, or foolish, well-oiled dispositions, who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he whistled life away in perfect contentment, but his wife continued dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying, and that, by frequent use, had grown into a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house, which, in truth, belongs to a henpecked husband. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye as the cause of his master's going so often astray. Truth it is, in all points of spirit befitting an honourable dog, he was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods. But what courage can withstand the ever-enduring and all-besetting terrors of a woman's tongue? The house, his crest fell. His tail drooped to the ground or curled between his legs. He sneaked about with gallows air, casting many a sidelong glance at Dame Van Winkle, and at the least flourish of fly to the door with yelping precipitation. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a long while he used to console himself, when driven from home, by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of that village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. Here they used to sit in the shade through a long lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip, or telling endless sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been heard the profound discussions that sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveller. How solemnly they would listen to the contents, as drawled out by Derek von Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junto were completely controlled by Nicholas Vedder, a patriarch of the village and landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to keep in the shade of a large tree so that the neighbours could tell the hour by his movement as accurately as by a sundial. It is true he was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. His adherents, and had his adherents, perfectly understood him, and knew how to gather his opinions. When anything that was read or related displeased him, he was observed to smoke his pipe vehemently, and to send forth short, frequent, and angry puffs. But when pleased, he would inhale tranquilly and emit it in light and placid clouds, and sometimes, taking the pipe from his mouth and letting the fragrant vapour curl about his nose, would gravely nod his head in token of perfect approbation. From even this stronghold the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquillity of that assemblage, and call the members all to naught, nor was that august personage, Nicholas Vedder himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago, who charged him outright with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labour of the farm and clamour of his wife was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. Here he would sometimes seat himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, with whom he sympathized as a fellow-sufferer in persecution. "Poor Wolf," he would say, Thy mistress leads thee a dog's life of it, but never mind, my lad. Whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee." Wolf would wag his tail, look wistfully into his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. In a long ramble of the kind, on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favourite spot, still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself, late in the afternoon, on a green knoll covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. From an opening between the trees he could overlook all the lower country for a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course, purple cloud or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on its glassy bosom, and at last losing himself in the blue highlands. On the other side he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and shagged, the bottom filled with fragments from the impeding cliffs and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time Rip lay musing on this, was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance, hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip!" He looked around, but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, and turned again to descend, when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same time, Wolf bristled up, giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction, and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see him being in this lonely, unfrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around the waist, several pairs of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the side and bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his and mutually relieving one another, they clambered up the narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long, rolling peals, like distant thunder, that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or left, between lofty rocks, toward which their rugged path conducted. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often take place in the mountain heights, he proceeded. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small, surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which impending trees shot their branches, so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky and the bright evening cloud. During the whole time Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying a keg of liquor up this wild mountain, yet there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe and checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level was a company of odd-looking personages playing ninepins in a quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins with long knives on their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large beard, broad-faced, and small, piggish eyes. The face consisted entirely of nose, and was surmounted by a white sugar-loaf hat set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a laced doublet, broad belt and hanger, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlour of Dominie van Schuyt, the village parson, and which had been brought over the Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest faces, the most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness but the noise of the balls which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with such fixed statue-like gaze, and such strange cluster countenances, that his heart turned within him, and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons, and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling, then quaffed the liquor in profound silence, and then returned to their game. Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavour of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head gradually declined, and he fell in. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. "Surely," thought Rip, "I have not slept here all night." The occurrences before he fell asleep: the strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at ninepins, the flagon. "Oh, that flagon! That wicked flagon!" thought Rip. "What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle?" He looked around for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He was now suspected that the grave roysters of the mountain had put a trick on him, and having dosed him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him, and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. Let's see, I believe that is a good stopping point. Yeah, that's a good, whoops. That's a good middle ground stopping point. Let me just go ahead and mark this. Doot, doot, doot. Okay. Now I would like to speak to you for a moment. I know there's only 2 of you in the chat right now, but the last couple of times I did this on Monday night. But I was wanting to do this on a Saturday to see if this was more doable. So, what are y'all's opinion? Do you think that I should keep doing this on Saturday? Thank you, Bugs Official. But the reason I ask is how y'all, whichever is easiest for y'all, will depend on if I do this. Let me check my schedule. I do this again on the 3rd or on the 30th. I think I just nodded off there for a minute. Last time I did this for a full hour. Of course, I also did not plan very well. And I think The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was longer than I anticipated. But I think Rip Van Winkle is going to be shorter. So maybe we'll be able to do this in less than an hour. Okay, alright, well. Just because it's not in the middle of a work week, I think I'm going to do this. I'm going to set a schedule. I'm going to go ahead and schedule another live stream for the second part of Rip Van Winkle. It feels weird to not take an hour to finish, but anyway, thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you next time. I forgot the exit that I did last time. Right, that's right. Alright, thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time. Now get some rest and call me in the morning.